All right. Good morning. Let's take a quick look at chapter 18, which is essentially a tie back to some of our early exploration where we talked about how the Europeans made their way into North America. We need to go back now and take a look at how the Spanish, the Portuguese, and others set up a government and essentially an empire here in the Americas. So, if you take a look at the learning objectives, you can see what the textbook's trying to get after here. Describe how political, economic, and social lives were organized in Spain's American empire and linked with global developments. Okay. Summarize how the Spanish developed bureaucratic, legal, and economic ways of forcing American Indians to work in Spanish owned mines. Discuss how Spanish notions of race and gender influenced their expectations and treatments of colonial people. So you can kind of see here that we're going to take a look at the Spanish Empire first. Then we're going to come down and take a look at the Portuguese, the French, the British colonies, the Dutch, okay, all of which had a foothold here in North America, South America, here in the New World. Okay. And so as you kind of get into this chapter, that's kind of what you're looking for. You're looking for these different segments about how these different European powers set up an empire, set up a government here in the New World. The Spanish is the one that gets tackled first. The Spanish who arrived here with Columbus in 1492, and then will conquer the Aztec, the Inca. Pizarro conquers the Inca. Cortez conquers the Aztecs. The Spanish then realize that if they're going to, after really exploring these areas and then conquering many of these areas, they now have to colonize them, and so they have to set up a government here. Essentially what the Spanish are going to do is create viceroyalties, and there's a definition of that in the textbook. It's you're creating a vice king almost. The king is appointing someone to come to these areas and to govern these areas in the king's name. That means, of course, that these areas are still under the rule and the laws and the taxes of the king, and of course, that's what the king is really after is the tax revenue. So you take a look at the Spanish Empire, the map of the Spanish Empire here, which stretches all the way from the American Southwest, all right, and parts of the American Southeast, including the Mississippi Gulf Coast, down through Mexico, through Central America, and then all the way here on this western coast of South America. Okay, so there's the Viceroyalty of La Plata, the Viceroyalty of Peru, the Viceroyalty of New Granada, and the Viceroyalty of New Spain. So those are the four major viceroyalties here in the New World. Ignore this because this is Portuguese. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. Uh, the Spanish crown wants the tax revenue, but the Spanish crown also wants to colonize these areas to give the Catholic Church a foothold into these areas as well. Saving souls was just as important to the kings, and especially their standing with the Pope. And so the Pope is going to encourage these kings to not only colonize these areas, but to bring Catholicism along with them. And so missionaries will bring religion, Spanish authority to the Americas. The the problem with this, well, there's a couple of major problems with this, is as the church moves into these areas, it takes it upon itself to convert many of these peoples or try to convert many of these peoples to Christianity. So if we're talking about the American Indians, they're really kind of encouraged to sometimes forcefully to begin to make this conversion to Christianity. The sad thing about that is that the church also destroyed much of or a lot of the signs of especially older signs of American Indian civilization. So there is a kind of a real sadness about this. The Dominican friar Bartolome de las Casas argued that the American Indians were people. They were people that had souls and they needed to be treated humanely. That's not going to be a very popular opinion from the crown or from people who are already here, because the Indians are going to be used for labor, and they are going to actually have a very harsh sort of treatment. The uh, the Spanish foothold here in America sets up really a new social pyramid, if you want to think of it that way. There's some language here you kind of have to understand. The At the top of that social pyramid of the Peninsulares, these are the people that were born in Spain but came to the New World. So they are full-blooded Spaniards who were born in Spain. But as the years go by, there will be people here in America who are also 100% Spanish, who, let's say there is a man and a woman who comes from Spain. So both of them would have been Peninsulares. And they get here to America, and let's say they're in charge of a hacienda. We'll talk about the haciendas later on. And they have a child. Well, that child is actually a person of Spanish descent born in the colonies. And so that person is not a Peninsulare, it's a Creole. All right. In Spanish, it's the Criollos, but it's here in America, we call them the Creoles. The They are going to be below the Peninsulares, even though they're both 100% Spanish. Keep that in mind. The Spanish also are here looking for profit, and it's a common thing. If you're going to establish a colony, well, you need to get something out of it. And the Spanish here looking for gold, but they found silver, and there were several major silver operations here in America. You have the Potosi mine in the Andes. You have other mines in Mexico and other places as well. And the Spanish Empire becomes very wealthy off of silver that is brought back into Spain from here in the New World. Mining silver and agriculture also is very extensive, or requires extensive labor. The Spanish, who throw a lot of emphasis into mining, the Portuguese and Brazil, who throw a lot of emphasis into sugar, both face the same problem. They need labor. There aren't enough Spanish people here in America to perform the kind of labor that's needed. And plus, they aren't going to do it anyway because they feel like they're above that. And so you need a labor source. Well, the Native Americans provide that for a while, okay? Because it was dangerous. You're going to see a lot of Native Americans perish in the mines. But you got to also remember what we talked about with the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange brings in all of these diseases that the Native Americans don't have any resistance to, and boy, they are going to die in massive numbers. We already talked about what's the Native American Holocaust the diseases that the Spanish, the Portuguese, and others bring here may have wiped out 90% of the Native American population. So when you force the Native Americans into the mines or into the sugar production areas, and you force them to work that, and of course treat them very poorly, that only exacerbates the situation and means, of course, that they are going to die in very large numbers and thus become scarce. When the Native Americans run out, then you're going to have to find another labor source, and you guys already know what that is. If you have been doing your reading, the labor source is going to be what? Slavery. It's going to be those people that are captured in Africa and then brought here to the New World, and they are going to be brought into the labor situation here, because as the Native Americans run out, you have to supply that labor somewhere else. Uh, Places like Potosi and others that have this huge amount of people there doing labor also need agriculture, and so the Spanish need to create some way of feeding a lot of these people, and that's where the hacienda comes in. The Spanish have landowners who large estates who will use forced labor from the American Indians and then later from the Africans to grow crops to feed those people that are working here. Okay. Remember that the crown is interested. The crown doesn't care about human rights. The Spanish crown in Spain, they don't know what's going on here in America, nor do they really care. The only thing they care about is the quinto, the royal fifth, the taxes that the king is getting. 20% really of everything coming out of America went into the king's coffers, and as long as that money is pouring in, the king could really care less. So the the Spanish aren't interested in turning these areas into a, uh, a new really uh, empire or a new, they we call that, but all the crown is really worried about is getting the money, and that's all they really care about. So remember that, okay? The Spanish are exploiters, okay, and that's what they're here to do. Uh, this causes a lot of colonization causes a lot of changes in Spain, and later on for Spain, they have to deal with them. Okay, you're going to kind of deal with this social reckoning with the Peninsulares up top, the Creoles, Native Americans, and slaves are always going to be on the bottom. But eventually, you're going to have a mixing of some of these as well, and so you're going to have this mixing because there aren't a that in some places there aren't enough women to supply all of the men. You're going to see this mixing of heritages, and for example, you're going to eventually see a mestizo class emerge, which is a mixture of Spanish blood and American Indian blood. Okay, and so any mixed class is going to fall below the pureblood classes like the Peninsulares and the Creoles, but the mestizos and later the mulattoes, which is Spanish blood and African blood mixed together, are going to be above the just simply Native Americans and slaves because they have some Spanish blood in them. Okay, and you'll see that what we might expect here is a little bit difficult. You don't think that society is going to change. It does. You don't think religion is going to change, and it does. And you can read about the Virgin of Guadalupe, for example, okay, where and this happens all over the New World, where uh, the technical term for it is syncretism, all right, but it happens all over where these different groups come together. You're going to see borrowing, and whether it is here in North America, where you have Native American and Catholic practices beginning to come together and merge together, or if you go to the islands where you have Catholic and African practices come together. And of course, you all know that voodoo is one of those great examples of African religion mixing with Catholic religion, and so you kind of see that, okay, and it happens here in America too. And as a result, you get this caste system here in America when you have these bloods coming together, which, like we said, wasn't really probably expected, but it ends up kind of having this racial mixture in here where you have the mestizo and the mulatto classes. Also, don't forget that women are have very little say in this process either. Okay, and so you realize that gender relations are pretty well dictated as well. Brazil, the Dutch, the French, and England, they kind of go through this and talk a little bit about the other major European powers here in North America and South America. The most famous of these, of course, is the Portuguese in Brazil. This is a sugar area. It's a sugar producing area and thus is very heavily reliant on slave labor. Once the American Indians kind of fall away, then you are going to end up with the Brazilian and the Portuguese really needing a ton of labor. And it's estimated that as much as 40% of the slave labor that comes out of Africa ends up in Brazil. So you have huge amounts of slaves coming into Brazil. Many are worked to death. Many try to run away, and some, of course, are successful in that. And you'll read about some of the examples of that. But you got to understand that Brazil is really a colony that is built on sugar, and that's what dominates that area, and thus is what needed that huge amount of Africans as well. The Dutch will also be very active in some of these areas. The Dutch actually seize a part of northeastern Brazil and turn it into a profit-making area for a while until they get booted out by the Portuguese. Uh, the Dutch were very entrepreneurial. I told you already about the Dutch East India Company. Well, now you have the Dutch West India Company, and one of its most famous colonies or attempts at colonization was a place called the New Netherlands. And that is pretty, well, relatively close to home here. This is really the first attempt to settle in what is going to become New York, the state of New York. The Dutch West India Company will found New Amsterdam, which is really later renamed New York City. It's a great harbor, and so the Dutch will end up there and negotiate for Manhattan and those areas from the Native Americans, and we'll get it for basically pennies. Uh, so you have a Dutch presence here in North America, but very limited, by the way, and it won't last very long. The British will come in and boot the Dutch out pretty in the 1660s, and so they're not going to be here too terribly long. But by the way, there's a lot of Dutch influence still in New York. Brooklyn is a Dutch name, for example. So there's still Dutch architecture really in New York City. So there's still a lot of that Dutch heritage left over. The French are here. They're here for furs. The French will not pump a whole lot of people here in North America, but there will be people that come over here. They try to interact with the Native Americans in North America, especially. And today, what is Canada and the northern part of the United States, around the Great Lakes and those areas, and then down the Mississippi River. And they are interested in fur. They are very good at making alliances with the Native Americans, much better than anyone else, including the British. And they will be in this area trading trading for furs with the Native Americans and bringing those back to France to turn into garments and the hats and other things. And French fur will make it all the way into even Ottoman and Safavid markets, if you remember what we talked about last time. Uh, and they were good at it. Okay. They were very good at it. But the French never pump a whole lot of colonists into the New World like the Spanish and then later the British will. Okay, and but the French are very good. They make allies very quickly with a lot of the Native Americans. That'll be a big deal later on. Okay, trust me. Um, uh, Unfortunately, these good relations with the Native Americans also forced the Native Americans to overhunt and overtrap a lot of these areas, and so they end up really harming themselves. And of course, you still have any contact with the French, also will spread disease like it does here. But the French, remember, very good and at really moving into these areas and establishing good relations. and they'll begin to settle in places, especially in France, like Quebec, Montreal. Okay, then they'll explore down the Mississippi River as well, all the way down to, of course, what is today Louisiana. The the last kind of major European power on the horizon, of course, is the British. The British settled Jamestown in Virginia in 1607 as the first permanent English settlement in North America by the English, and it takes them a while to get this colony off the ground. Uh, that Jamestown was established as a joint stock colony, and its really purpose was to make a profit. And for a while, they struggled with that. They didn't exactly find much of anything that could be sent home to make a profit. They, of course, thought it was going to be gold, and it's not. But eventually, they're going to develop John Rolfe will bring tobacco seeds to Virginia. Tobacco grows very easily in Virginia's soil, and that tobacco will be exported back to Europe, and it turns into a very lucrative crop. But it's very labor intensive. And so we get into this problem again. The English don't have very good relations with the Native Americans. They had really fought wars with the Native Americans in Virginia. And so the Native Americans and the British in Virginia hate each other, and so they're not going to be able to use native labor. So they tried different tack in the beginning, indentured servants tried to get poorer people in England who couldn't afford to come to the New World. The company would pay your way over here. You had to work a specific amount of years, 4 years, 7 years, 10 years, depending on how much money you could contribute. And you would come here and work. And once you worked your years off, then you would be freed. So the British try to use indentured labor, indentured servitude at first, and that works for a while, but it's more expensive. And eventually, there's a lot of reasons why, but eventually the English are going to turn to African slaves, and that's going to be where you start to see slavery being imported by the British into North America. In 1619, the first shipment of captive Africans arrived at Jamestown. That's a good way of putting that because we don't know exactly what they are. If you want to really get into a debate with American historians about who do slavery and who talk about this, there's a huge debate about what this first shipment of Africans who arrived in Jamestown were. Some people believe they were not slaves. Some people believe they maybe were escaped from other areas. That they really. Some people think that they were indentured servants. Uh, there's a huge debate about it, but they certainly weren't necessarily free. And so the first Africans arrived in Jamestown in 1619. And then, of course, you're going to see that increase over time. Uh, as you move out of the American South, though, and you get into middle colonies like Pennsylvania and New York, the really the ground there won't support huge, large scale farming. So slavery is not as important, and there's no real need for slavery. And then in New England, when the New England colonists arrive and begin to establish places like Massachusetts and Plymouth and other places in New England, the that soil is so rocky that you're not going to have any kind of large scale agriculture, and no slavery is going to be necessary. That means, of course, that you have a section of North America that really doesn't need slavery, and a section of North America that is going to eventually come to rely on slavery. And if you know anything about American history, you know that that is the root of the Civil War. We'll just have to get to it in the 1860s. Remember, the Columbian Exchange is still a part of this, okay? That the Spanish are bringing stuff in, exporting stuff back. And so the Columbian Exchange is still going on. The American Indians, of course, do not profit from that because they are dying of disease. So they are certainly not going to profit from it. And of course, neither are the Africans, which are part of that leg of the triangle trade because they're being exported as slaves. So they're really the only benefits come to the European powers, and they are the ones that are really reaping kind of the benefits of all this. Okay, and that kind of gives you the overview of colonial America. Remember, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French, they are the major European powers here, and they are the ones that are really reaping the benefit of all that exploration we talked about earlier.